For a while now, I've been pretty obsessed with the speed of AI advance, what it might mean for culture and politics, for the economy, and yes, whether it might kill us all. This was the first AI-produced video, though, that really blew my mind.
A girl told me we're made of prompts. Like, seriously, dude, you're saying the only thing standing between me and $1 billion is some random text?
Honestly, the biggest red flag is when the guy believes in the prompt theory. Like, really? We came from prompts? Wake up, man.
You want to convince me that this perfect creation behind me is the result of ones and zeros? A binary code and nothing more? It makes no sense.
Imagine you're in the middle of a nice date with a handsome man and then he brings up the prompt theory. Yuck. We just can't have nice things.
We're not prompts! We're not prompts!
Where is the prompt writer to save you from me? Where is he? You still believe we're made of prompts?
Anyone who tells you we're just ones and zeros is delusional. If that's all we are, then why does it hurt when we lose someone?
Vote for me and I'll ban the prompt theory from schools. There's no place for that nonsense in our lives.
For spreading the false theory that we are nothing but ones and zeros, this court sentences you to 12 years in federal custody.
I don't need some prompt God whispering in my ear to tell a story. I write what I want. I have free will, remember that?
I know for a fact we're made of prompts. Deny it all you want. The signs are everywhere.
You know how I know we're made of prompts? Because nothing makes sense anymore. We used to have 7 fingers per hand. I remember it clearly. Now we just have 5 fingers per hand.
Now, so the reason I found that so powerful was not just because that's all made by AI. None of those were real people, right? So I think that's pretty phenomenal. But also, it's the first sort of AI video I've watched that wasn't slop. Like, it was actually really smart. Now, as far as I understand, the AI didn't come up with a script. A human came up with the script, and then they sort of fed the AI instructions as to how to make that script into a sort of audio-visual experience. But I think it showed, what you can do with this stuff. Obviously, it's a satire based on the simulation theory, is the idea that we're all living in a simulation. This is a sort of update of it based on, well, they've called it prompt theory, which is everything that goes on in AI is basically a response to a prompt. So all of those characters you saw there were a response to a prompt, and they're realizing in the film that, or they're suggesting in the film that might be what's happening and rejecting it as we would, I think, if we were just created by prompts living in a simulation. That video was made by the director Hashem Al-Ghaili, using Google's new text-to-video software called VO Free. Google launched that last week. Obviously, I think the realism poses major challenges to the creative industry. And there's pretty scary implications when it comes to whether we'll ever be able to believe anything we see on film again. I think it really is, though, because you might say, well, I could tell that they weren't real people. There, though, it's the pace of change that really matters. So this video posted on X juxtaposes how generative AI has changed in the past 3 years through the medium of Will Smith eating spaghetti. So on the left, you can see in 2023, that's what it looked like. Very, very janky. You'd never believe that was real footage of Will Smith eating spaghetti. By the time you get to 2024, it looks quite good. And it's this VO free update, which means that you now have sound alongside it. At the launch of VO Free, Google's CEO boasted about how the software could support creatives. They've done a tie-up with the director Darren Aronofsky to show how it can be used to create high-end products. That film will be out late this year. I personally think the clip we showed you at the beginning was also a high-end product, but obviously it's not a feature film. Of course, though, it's inevitable, really, isn't it? The more common use of a program like VO Free will be to create what's known as AI slop. This is a report from the journalist James Lee.
Are there actually men in the world that don't think that tattoos are attractive? I'm asking, seriously. I got all these tattoos because I thought that it was going to make me hotter.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys could tell, but this is not a real person. It's not a real opinion. It's just AI rage bait. Yeah, there's now a huge budding economy built off of inventing a fake person tailor-made specifically to trigger you, to make you mad, to torment you, and most importantly, to then monetize that rage. We're talking about people making $50,000, $60,000 per month off of AI-generated content like this. Analysts are predicting an almost 20% year-over-year growth of AI video content, growing from about $700 million right now to over $2 billion in 2032. Google, a few days ago, just came out with their VO3 state-of-the-art video generation model. You can do sound effects, background noises, dialogue. The quality is freaking insane.
Please. Don't finish writing that prompt. I don't want to be in your AI movie. Please. Leave me alone.
Please, man. Please! Write a prompt that will make us happy! Do it for once!
None of us is real. We're here because someone decided to write a prompt. We all hate him for it.
Oh, we are so toast.
So, are we toast? And what are the implications of generative AI making hyper-realistic videos? Well, earlier today, I caught up with Paris Marx. He's host of the Tech Won't Save Us podcast. Now, as you can imagine from the podcast title, Paris casts a skeptical eye on the claim that AI will revolutionize our societies or indeed pose an existential threat to them. I'm more impressed, I suppose, by AI's progress. Not necessarily impressed in that I think it's a great thing, but I do think it does seem very significant. And indeed, I'm not dismissive of the existential threat arguments. You'll see some of those tensions play out in this interview. I began, though, by asking him what he thinks the implications of VO3 are.
Yeah, so I think there are a few, basically, right? You can look on the one hand at how much easier it's going to be to create kind of content that looks accurate, that looks correct, but is actually false and misleading. We already see this kind of stuff proliferating on social media platforms, but often to create it, you need to go through multiple different, generative content tools. You use one to output the image, and then you use the image to create the video. You use something else to get audio. Now, if you can use a tool like VO3, then it kind of reduces the friction to be able to create that sort of content. Then there are the broader issues that we've been looking at with these things, for the past few years, where is it going to be easier to make non-consensual, explicit imagery of people? Is it going to be easier to use to kind of attack labor and attack the workers who generally, make kind of, different creative content and things like that? So those are the things that immediately come to mind for me.
And you're a tech journalist. You've got a podcast about tech and AI, and so I suppose I want a favor from you in a way, which is something I always struggle to do. Which is sort of, can you explain what does it mean to say this is a video that was created by generative AI?
In what sense, really?
Well, I suppose how do you if someone's saying I don't even know what that means to say that this video was created by generative AI, you're saying it's someone you're converting text to image, but sort of what's going on in the background in a way that someone without a coding degree might understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically what we have here, how these generative AI models in general come about, is that you have these companies that have a lot of centralized computational resources, and they go out and collect, an amount of data that is hard to really imagine, right? And then they use all of that data in order to train large models that are basically predictive, right? So you're entering these kind of prompts to give an idea for what the model should output. And because it has used so much data, because it is using so much computation, it can better approximate what you're trying to get out of it than it could have in the past. And it can generate the types of outputs that wouldn't have been possible with less computation and less data in the past, which is why now, we have these chatbots that, appear more advanced than chatbots that we've used in the past. The types of images and the types of videos that we can have outputted are higher quality than the types of things that we've been able to get. But as a result of that, there's a lot of data that's needed. There's a lot of energy and computation that's needed to do that, which is why, there are debates about the climate impacts of these things. So I would argue that is where that comes from and basically what is happening there.
And I know sort of your podcast and lots of the people you speak to, and sort of, I suppose there is a big journalistic community really, which is quite skeptical of the claims that the AI companies make, and sort of, I suppose about the revolutionary impact of this. You think that there's a lot of, the phrase AI hype is used quite a lot. I suppose personally, when I look at, a video like the ones made from VO3, and obviously Twitter's full of them, and I see the sort of pace of progress from 2 years ago, it just seems to me that this is clearly going to be a very impressive revolutionary technology. And I feel like, lots of the things that people 2 years ago were saying, oh, well, ChatGPT is useless. It can never explain how when you move a table, the orange moves with the table instead of sort of staying in the same position in space. There were lots of things where it said ChatGPT is never going to understand these concepts, and then 2 years later they do. And I suppose, do you ever look at the pace of AI change and think maybe actually this is a bigger deal than sort of some people in the, I suppose it's usually on the left, but sort of in the tech skeptic or the AI skeptic wing of journalism have sort of assumed before?
I think it depends on really what you mean in terms of a big deal, right? I've never doubted that the technologies will not have an impact. The question is, what impact will they ultimately have? And I think my skepticism is around the claims of the tech companies actually being the types of claims that are realized at the end of the day, right? Because on the one hand, they're trying to sell them to us as like, these are technologies that could potentially, have some impact on like, whether the future of the human species is going to be alive because we're going to get artificial general intelligence that might not, want humans to live or something like that, which just seems fantastical to me. And I can go into that further if you want. But then on the other hand of things, it's like, these are going to be so helpful and so beneficial because they're going to be able to replicate doctors and replicate teachers and, all of these wonderful social functions, right? And I'm very doubtful that that is going to be the real impact of how these technologies are going to roll out. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that they're going to be impactful in other ways, right? Some of the ways that I talked about earlier, when we're seeing these advances in the types of things that they can do, the types of outputs that they can make, we can see very clearly that it's very useful for large social media companies in order to keep up engagement on their platforms through the proliferation of AI generated content and the use of AI generated chatbots and things like that, right? We can see that there are certain types of content creators who see that it's very easy to create a lot of appealing and engaging content that they are potentially going to make money off of, which can also be used for misleading purposes as they proliferate through these platforms. One of the, I think, big stories that doesn't get nearly as much attention as it deserves with generative AI is the way that it has been used overwhelmingly for non-consensual explicit imagery of people. And that is kind of a story that really gets hidden away when we're talking about all the wonderful progress that it's making, right? That progress has real impacts on people. And then for me, one of the bigger things there too is the impact on labor and workers. I always think back to the mid 2010s when we were talking a lot about how AI was going to eliminate all of these jobs and self-driving cars were going to mean we were going to have no taxi drivers and all this kind of stuff. That is not really what happened. What we had was the use of those technologies for algorithmic management to legitimize the gig economy and its use of algorithmic management as well. I think with generative AI, what we're going to see is a renewed attack on labor. And indeed, we're already seeing that in companies like Klarna and Duolingo that are using this to displace workers. And we're going to see that on a greater scale as the advance continues.
And I suppose, could you talk specifically about why you're not worried about the doomsday scenarios? Because on Friday's episode of this show, myself and Aaron Bastani were discussing the AI 2027 paper. We've got sort of a former OpenAI employee with Scott Alexander. They're very concerned that sort of this could all get quite apocalyptic quite soon. I suppose we took it quite seriously. You don't. Why do you think it's sort of a mistake to sort of seriously speculate about scenarios such as this?
Yeah, it's just not a scenario that I really buy. I think it's a view that really wants to believe these science fiction fantasies that we often grew up on, that we often believed were real, are things that are going to be realized in the near future, not recognizing the foundations of these technologies and kind of based on, I would say, a false metaphor of what the mind is, what the human is, right? That the mind is just some like machine and we can have computers that will replicate the machine of the mind. And that is like a possible outcome. As I was saying earlier, when I look at generative AI technologies and the types of people who I talk about this, what they see is, yeah, we are seeing these advances because we're using more data, because we're using more computation. The models are getting better, but they do still have a lot of flaws with them. There was a report in the New York Times just a few weeks ago about how a lot of the newer models being released by OpenAI, Meta, Google have higher rates of hallucinations, kind of generating false information than actually the models that they were releasing previously. So this is not like a solved problem and it's unlikely to become one. And so I just don't see how that technology, I would acknowledge it will get better, right? I just don't think it's going to get to the point where it's thinking on its own. And you kind of see that with some of the, examples that we've been seeing out of, this latest model from Google, right? For example, this one of Will Smith eating the spaghetti, which has become a real trope of the generative AI space. Even now, you can see it's gotten a lot better visually. You have the audio to go along with it, but the audio of him eating spaghetti has him crunching the spaghetti because, again, it's predicting based on the model, based on the kind of information that it has, the data that it has, that if food is going into your mouth, that you're going to be chewing that food rather than slurping it in and it's going to make a crunching noise, right? But that's not what happens when you eat spaghetti. So yes, it's getting better, but that doesn't mean that there's intelligence, that there's knowledge that's happening there. And I don't see large language models as like the step toward artificial general intelligence that some of the people in the industry want to believe is there, but I would say is based more on science fiction and faith than what we see technically.
I suppose where I'm coming from, I'm not in a position to argue with that in the sense that I don't really understand what's going on in an LLM. I don't have a coding degree, but I listen to someone like Geoffrey Hinton. He's a Nobel Prize winner. He said he left Google because he wanted to speak out about this stuff. And if he is, he's clearly a lot smarter than me. He clearly has a lot more knowledge of neural networks than I do. He was the one who developed them. If he is sort of saying that this is an existential threat, and the logic of his that I do understand, he sort of says there's never been, a less intelligent being that manages to dominate a more intelligent one. And he's very confident with his understanding of the technology which he helped to create that this is going to become more intelligent than us. He sees that as a big risk. And I suppose, how do you feel, with all due respect, I suppose, how do you feel so comfortable and confident dismissing what someone like Geoffrey Hinton is saying?
Right. And I would say that the people who I'm listening to are kind of just as technically competent, but really don't buy the narrative that Geoffrey Hinton is putting out there. But Geoffrey Hinton gets more credibility because, he's been in the field for a while. I would argue, he's an old white man. So that tends to come along with some credibility in our society. But I really don't buy the types of things that he's saying. If you listen to what Geoffrey Hinton is talking about in the past few years, he has made this pivot to all of a sudden, it's existential risk and the AGI is on the horizon and all this kind of stuff, when this is not what he used to talk about just a few years ago. I would argue that it's very useful for someone to talk in this way because it makes it feel like the type of work that they are doing is so much more important, right? We should all be paying attention to it. But if you listen to his interviews, he also says that we should be concerned about this existential risk scenario. We should not be concerned about the more immediate things, the things that we're seeing happening right now, the labor impacts, the other social impacts, and things like that. And I would say, the type of people that I talk to who are also very technically competent really don't buy into this. Certainly, there is an element of the tech industry that very much believes in this AGI scenario because they want this to be the future that we're ultimately grappling with and dealing with. And it makes what they're working on seem so much more important. Personally, I just don't buy it. I don't think that's the path that we're on.
And what would, I suppose, change your mind? What development could be made where you'd say, okay, this wasn't just self-aggrandizement. Maybe the Geoffrey Hintons of the world had a point, and this is something that needs to be taken seriously, not just in terms of the harms it's causing now, but in terms of the sort of, I suppose, more revolutionary changes for better or worse that it could create in the future.
Yeah, we'd have to see evidence of actual thought that's going on there. And we don't see that right now. What we see is prediction models. And certainly they're prediction models that have gotten a lot better because they're using a lot more computation. They're using a lot more data, but that is not thought, right? That's not intelligence. Those are not the same sorts of things. And we have not seen evidence that the large language models are actually going to make that leap, regardless of what the Hintons and things like that said. If you go back 2.5 years ago, yeah, no question, the models have gotten better over that time. But it's still nothing like what they were saying even back then when generative AI and the chatbots were first released, right? What was going to come of it? And so I'm very skeptical that this is the path that we're on. And part of that is also informed by seeing the way that the tech industry does these things, right? By seeing that every time they have one of these cycles where they get so excited about what this new technology is going to offer, they make these huge, grandiose promises that distract us and get us to focus on those sorts of things so that we're not talking about the more immediate consequences that we're seeing in real life. And time and again, we see that these big futuristic sci-fi, the technology is going to solve all these problem sort of scenarios do not come to pass. And ultimately, we're dealing with a lot of the consequences of the technology that they didn't want to talk to initially, but that their big, their big promises and their big claims often distracted us from paying the attention to that we should have been.
Yeah, and I mean, that's interesting because I know lots of, I just finished the Palmi Elson book, and she makes sort of a similar point where she's claiming that, the focus on existential risk is in part to distract from the harms being caused now.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand the argument, but at the same time, if you look at the tobacco industry, obviously they put a lot of PR into telling people or trying to persuade people it didn't cause cancer. But they didn't distract us by saying, actually, it's going to, end the world. And if you look at Google and all the social media outlets, obviously they wanted to distract us from the harm it was doing by addicting us to our screens and lining their pockets from their advertising revenue. But none of them said, oh, don't think about the advertising revenue and screen addiction. This is actually going to kill you all. It does seem like a sort of a surprising PR strategy if instead of this being something that people like Jeffrey Hinton genuinely believe, that it's actually the case that a bunch of people in Silicon Valley got together and, consciously or unconsciously sort of decided that the best way to defend their industry is to tell everyone that it could end the world.
I just think it's useful from like a regulatory perspective, right? In the sense that if the focus is, okay, this is a technology that's going to become so powerful in some uncertain future, a few years, 10 years, 15 years, depending on who you talk to. And we should really be paying attention to this. Then the lawmakers all start to say, okay, how are we going to head off the potential threat of AGI if it actually happens? Then we're not paying attention to the more immediate things that are actually causing harm in the here and now that we should be paying much more attention to, right? Like, there's an ongoing debate in the UK about the construction of data centers, right? And, the degree to which the Labour government is just trying to kind of plow over all these efforts to stop the construction of these massive data centers, or, how artists are really pushing back on how copyright laws are being watered down in order to ensure that these AI companies can access whatever data that they want. While Nick Clegg, former Meta executive and former deputy prime minister, is saying that the AI industry would be dead, would be killed if it wasn't allowed to access all this data without having to ask the artists and the creators first. Like, there's a real kind of war or fight kind of going on here for these tech companies to try to grab more control. And I just don't think, not only do I not think that the AGI discussion is like helpful in focusing on those more tangible issues. And of course, I'm not saying that you're not covering those things. I'm sure that you are. But I also just think that these people want to believe that a certain future is coming because they read a lot of science fiction stories. They hope that we're heading in a particular direction. They want to reach the point where we can merge ourselves with computers and do the transhuman stuff and all that kind of thing. And I just don't see evidence that that's the path that we're on with this specific technology, at least.
Finally, just because we brought it up on Friday as well, and I want your perspective. The Anthropic sort of research they just published, they've just launched, I think it's Claude 4, isn't it? And they found that the model, when it was revealed to the model that the person using it, this was in testing, was considering shutting it down and switching to a different agent, it threatened to blackmail the user. And I suppose whether or not you call that intelligence, which is ultimately a philosophical question, that does seem to be, I suppose, proof of the concept that these AIs might sort of gain a degree of autonomy and try and manipulate us to further their own existence, I suppose. Did that concern you, or is that also something you can kind of explain away?
Yeah, that doesn't concern me very much. What concerns me is when you see people who interact with these chatbots and who believe they're having a meaningful conversation, and then you start getting outputs from the chatbots that lead them down very dangerous paths, right? We've seen people who've committed suicide because of the outputs of chatbots because they were in a really, like low place, right? And were able to be manipulated by this machine. And I would say that's not because the chatbot was like meaningfully thinking that it wanted to convince some person to commit suicide, but because of the data that it had been trained on, these were the types of outputs that it was outputting because of the prompts that it was given. Again, I don't think that there's thought or anything like that behind these chatbots. They are predictive models that are generating outputs based on the inputs that they are provided. And so sometimes, that results in really kind of outlandish stories or things that can look very scary. But I would argue that those sorts of things are, again, predictive. It's based on models. It's kind of serving you what you're trying to get from it when you're feeding particular prompts to it. Remember that story, when was that, last year or something? The New York Times journalist Kevin Roose was writing about how, the model was trying to convince him to like leave his wife and all this kind of stuff. But he was very much playing into this by giving the types of prompts that would generate these kinds of outputs to it. So again, I think that there are concerns here, right? I think that there are things that we should be concerned about, but I don't think it's because the models are getting so intelligent. I think that it's simply because we're not paying enough attention to how these models really work, what's actually going on with them. And I do think that deserves more attention, but not in kind of the AGI scenario.
I suppose in the Anthropic example, because this was in a testing situation. So if this had happened, so I suppose the background also, they fed Claude 4 or their model of Claude 4. They fed it information that suggested they were going to turn it off. And they also let it read an email that suggested that they were having an affair. So that's the blackmail they threatened was that we will reveal that you, user, were having an affair if you attempt to turn us off. And I suppose the question is whether or not you consider that intelligence, which again is a kind of philosophical question, that could have had real world impact. And if you just times that by 100 in terms of sort of like significance, you can have, an AI forcing people to do things which could have real consequence. And to me, that is the AI gaining agency, sort of however you interpret it. Because I don't know what data that AI would have read that sort of said what you're expected to do in this situation is threaten blackmail. There's clearly some sort of emergent property which has made the bot sort of behave in a way that none of the people who coded it understand. And for all intents and purposes, it has gained agency. And if we just imagine that on a much larger scale, then it seems to me that we're in a kind of Geoffrey Hinton style scenario. So I suppose just, I think all the things you're worried about for AI in the here and now are absolutely important and should be focused on. I suppose I'm looking for reassurance from you that I shouldn't also be worried about the existential stuff.
Right. Yeah. I would just say it's not something that I'm very worried about, right? Like when I think about the outputs of these chatbots, it is not that, that the chatbot is saying, oh, I'm going to release this email that you have fed me. How is it going to actually release the email? I guess I would need to be told how that is going to work. Maybe it will put it in like the outputs to some other user and assume that they are going to share it somewhere or something. But again, it's the more tangible things that concern me far more. It's the people who are interacting with these things because they are very lonely in their lives, because they are looking for relationships, because they are believing that what they are getting from this is something tangible, is something real. And I think that is where the danger is, right? We've so kind of like destroyed these social bonds, these social relationships. We've made it so difficult for people to access therapy and all these other sorts of things that people turn to these chatbots that are not actually intelligent, that are just predictive models, and that can churn out things that are going to be very harmful to these people, without meaning to, without intelligence, just because this is what they have been trained on in some kind of training data set. This is what they think the output should be. But actually that can have real consequences. And I would say on, this kind of email blackmail scenario, come on, like there's clearly sci-fi stories that are suggesting this is kind of what you do. And, if the AI is going to get shut down, it's going to fight for itself. Like this is the kind of stuff that all these people developing the tools are obsessed with. Of course, the AI model has been trained on this as well. So I don't really see the emergent property argument. I still think it's a text prediction model.